All right, hello everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of student government, I would like to thank everyone for joining and everyone attending this event. I'm excited to announce that we have a special guest. He is a author, playwright, actor, and the founder and creative director of the I Am Project, which is an organization dedicated to educating and entertaining and engaging on suicide prevention and mental health awareness. So our event today is titled How to Live Mentally Well and Crush It During Difficult Times. And so really that is going to be talking about incorporating real life scenarios with real life personal coping mechanisms. And so throughout this whole event, it will be recorded. So if you have some worries about showing your face, please turn off your camera and there will be a Q&A session. So at that Q&A session, cameras we'll stop the recording, and so cameras will be allowed to turn back on if you're able to ask your question in person. If you do not feel comfortable asking your question in front of everyone, you can privately message myself or the speaker himself, and they will be asked for you. In addition to that, YSU has a great resource for mental health and counseling in general. So that is the student counseling services. And so they are able to have appointments Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Virtually through WebEx. And they're located in Kilcawley on room 2110. Appointments can be made in advance and also can be made outside the time of operation. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest, Joshua Rivedal.
Avery, thank you so much. Thank you for putting this event together. You and your team did a fantastic job. So I am so grateful to be, I can't say here, but present with everybody. I'm glad to be with you at Youngstown State. Welcome to my living room. Welcome to Zoom. Welcome to COVID. Yeah, so I do these talks, I want to say 40 to 50 times, somewhere between 40 and 50 times a year, most of the universities, college students. So today, we're pretty much explicitly going to be talking about mental health. But what I want to do actually is take a little preface. So this is housekeeping. We're doing a little housekeeping. Then I want to do a little preface to the event, kind of talking a little bit about COVID and what that means around our mental health, just sort of briefly. Then I want to talk a little bit about my story and my journey because that's important and I'll explain why. And then we'll do a little bit of slide share, like some pseudo lecture, but nothing like really obnoxious lecture, but like hopefully like interweaving story. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And that really is my most favorite part because we're actually sharing and engaging in ideas and talking to one another. And that's really important. I'm not the only expert in this room. All of y'all are experts in your lives and in your stories and where you've been and where you're going. And so when we combine those two together, we have an opportunity to teach each other, and I'm not the only teacher in this room, right? So that's huge to me, and that's how we move our feet is when we all become teachers. So, little preface to this. So when we all basically first heard about COVID, it was around like early middle of March. And as I said, I do this work, and I'm on the road probably about 100 days a year throughout mostly North America. And so I got back, I was living in LA at the time. I'm now in Philadelphia, but I was living in LA at the time and I had just gotten back from a long trip doing this work. And as soon as I got back, basically California and then subsequently the United States, more or less, basically shut down. You know, and you know, all of my work was pretty much at the time was canceled and life felt canceled. And I started freaking out and I was like, what's going on? What's happening with my life? What's happening with the world? And for about the next 2 weeks, like I had a really difficult time eating and sleeping. And I just felt like I was in sort of a dream state, in a malaise. I kind of felt like a bit of a zombie and I couldn't quite hack it. I couldn't quite figure out what was going on in my head and my body and my life. And I finally, about 2 weeks in, so this was probably either the end of March or the very beginning of April, I was like, wait a minute, Josh. A, you already live with generalized anxiety disorder. So you're like, all those chemicals are bumping right now in your body and telling you that you're in danger. So that's one thing that you're experiencing. Another thing that you're experiencing is anxiousness. General anxiousness. And so that was what was going on. And also I was grieving the loss of so many different things that were supposed to happen, a relationship, friendships that I couldn't take part in, the work. And so, if you know anything about grieving and mourning, there's a lot of different steps and stages that are not super linear, but when we don't have awareness around it, it makes it really difficult to grieve and mourn because we don't really know what to identify as what's happening. Like, why am I tired all the time? Why am I lashing out? Why am I not getting along with so-and-so? And it's like, wait a minute, I'm grieving, I'm mourning. I need to own that and take note of that. And then once I do that, I'm able to access that coping mechanism or that resource that I need. But when we don't have that awareness around it, and I didn't at the time, I wasn't really able to do anything about it. So that was sort of the slow and steady march toward health and wellness, or back to it rather. But something also happened in around that time period. I actually ended up calling a friend of mine, Brian, who lives in Denver. He's a good dude, very self-aware, does this work a little bit as well. And so I was talking to him and I was like, Brian, and I was explaining everything that was happening on my body and my brain. And I hadn't told anybody about this yet. And he was like, oh my gosh, Josh, thank you so much for bringing this up and talking about it. I've been experiencing something similar and I haven't told anyone about it either. And so just by you telling me about your experience, it's making me feel a bit more buoyant and a bit better. And I was like, wow. So one thing I want to just sort of toss at you from that conversation, and there's a second part to the conversation, is just that while we're going through this period of time and beyond, but specifically while we're going through COVID-19 and this pandemic and everything that's associated with it, sharing our stories, at least one-on-one, can be so powerful and can be so helpful. It's that element of self-disclosure. You have opportunities to share resources, to share camaraderie, friendship, and ultimately it can help you feel more buoyant. So sharing our stories and sharing our experiences can be very, very, very helpful. And typically speaking, when someone is in a crisis and it's a prolonged sense of crisis, they probably haven't shared their story. They haven't shared what's going on with them. So it's really important that we don't get to that point and we share what's happening in our life and in our world and in our brains and our bodies. So the second part to this conversation was this. As my friend Brian was talking a little bit later in the conversation, he said something that hit me in a very profound way. He said, at least I don't have it as bad as so-and-so, talking about the experience that he was having. And he was comparing it to, I can't remember who, but he was like, at least I don't have it as bad as so-and-so. And it took me a few moments and I asked him if I could sort of challenge him. And he agreed. And I said, Brian, that should be a point of gratitude. At least I don't have it as bad as so-and-so. But from where I stood and what he was talking and the way he was using that phrase, it was as if he was marginalizing his own experience. He wasn't allowing himself to have the feelings and the emotions that he was going through because somebody else had it worse than him. So he had nothing to complain about. And I was like, we do that so often as human beings. I don't have anything to cry about. I don't have it as bad as my ancestors. I don't have it as bad as that group over there. But we need to not do that because I can empathize with that group, that person who I don't have it as badly as. I can certainly do that and maybe work and help them on the come up. But on the flip, like I will never ever live in their brain or their body. So I will only ever know my own experience, right? So I can't really truly compare the severity. So all I can do is lean into the emotions and sit with them and listen to them because those emotions and those feelings, they're trying to teach us something. They're whispering to us and they want us to learn something. They want us to stop repeating a certain pattern or they want us to do differently or healthier or better. And when we don't listen to them and when we avoid and when we push aside, then those patterns are going to continue. Those emotions are going to keep surfacing and we're going to keep pushing them down. They're going to come out and they're going to be louder and louder and it's going to show up in difficult ways. So we really need to take that time and be grateful for that. Maybe we don't have it as badly as so-and-so, but then also use those emotions and those experiences to really lean in and listen. We're like, hey, what am I supposed to be learning from this grief or this trauma or this difficult time right now? And it's a much healthier way to experience life, right? So just wanted to sort of give a little context around a choice that we can make as we're moving through this difficult period, because this is not going to be the last difficult thing that we're ever going to experience. There's going to be deaths. There's going to be, the loss of a relationship. There's going to be the loss of a job. There's going to be, and sometimes even there's going to be a happy thing or a good thing that we're going to have a difficult time preparing for and making room for And so we might have some difficult feelings around that. We're like, wait, I should be grateful. What's happened? Why do I feel like garbage? And I just got this promotion. It's because we're not listening to those emotions and and we're not, working through these things that are helping us make long-term sustainable change, right? So we got to listen to these emotions. We got to listen to these feelings. All right, to the story, what I promised. So, and the reason I tell story, and story is so important, and I'm a professional storyteller. I've been a playwright in my life. I've been an actor. I'm an author. I'm a book editor. I'm a ghostwriter. I write marketing copy. And most of all, I do this work. This work is so important to me. And stories are so important because they ultimately, we use them to make sustainable change in the person or persons whom we're with or whom we're working to enact change in. Right? So stories are always for the benefit of the other person, and they do different things to the chemicals in our brains, and they allow us to connect to certain concepts and ideas. But around social justice and taboo and stigmatized topics, when we tell stories, it's no longer they and them who need help and who need to deal with these issues. It's now we and us, and we can work on these collectively and together, right? So that's why I tell story and tell stories. So here it is. Here's my story. And I'm not going to go all in detail, but I'm going to talk about some of the important things apropos to this conversation. So I grew up in New Jersey. Please don't hold it against me. It's not my fault. But I grew up in New Jersey as the middle kid of three kids. I was the middle one, and two parents. They were together. It was not a good experience. They should not have been together. The struggle was real, but nevertheless, they went through the motions and they more or less made it work. Where I came from in New Jersey, a lot of people thought that my family, even though we were very ensconced in poverty, even though we lived in a really difficult part of the hood, we really did. Even though we had that experience, a lot of people where I came from thought that we had it all together, and for a couple of reasons. One was that we were very, very involved in church, and that was basically the extent of my community at that period of time. I wouldn't say that's my community anymore, but it was at that time. And so as a family, we went to probably 5 church services a week. I went to school there. My dad was a deacon, which is, if you're familiar with the Christian structure, hierarchy of church, that's kind of a prominent position in the church. They sang in church all the time, very involved. And my parents were also very involved in the community and rallies and marches and political things like that. And so people looked at us and they were like, wow. And I think some of us have heard this analogy before, like people projected this idea of the white picket fence, like this idea of perfection. When we talk about that, that's usually like our idea of perfection or goodness, sort of, but projected onto somebody else. Like they have the girl, the job, the guy, the PhD, the house, the dogs, all of the above, etc. Right? And they were projecting that on me and my family. However, when we do that, when we project that white picket fence onto somebody else, we rarely take into account what that person is looking at on the other side of that fence. Because from my vantage point, my fence was cracked and chipped and broken. I had a very difficult experience as a young person growing up for a few reasons. One, we had 2 big secrets in my family, and these were 2 contributing factors to the difficult time that I had as a young person. One was my father, despite being a deacon involved in the church and the community, he was an abuser. He was emotionally abusive with his 3 kids and his wife, my mother, and he was physically abusive with me. And the reason I bring that up, yes, it did affect my mental health and wellness. But the reason I bring it up is because it can affect anybody's mental health and wellness, experiencing that kind of thing early on in life. And so what's traumatic to you might not necessarily be traumatic to me and vice versa, but whatever you experience, typically speaking, women before the age of 18, 1 in 3 women are going to have dealt with some form of abuse, and about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 men. And those are just broad strokes. The brain, though, is not done developing till about age 26, 27. The prefrontal cortex that deals with higher level reasoning and functioning and impulse control and things like that. So that's sort of that last thing, that higher level thing. And so really anything that the brain has to deal with while it's still developing, traumatically speaking, is going to affect the development of the brain. And so when that happens, we start to cope and deal with things in an unhealthy way. It might have worked as a young person, like I was trying to protect myself as a kid. So I did this or that, or I tried to protect myself and I withdrew, or I lied, or I cheated, or I stole because that was how I had to survive as a young person. However, those patterns can repeat into our adulthood when we don't deal with and realize like, oh my gosh, I was dealing with these things as a young person, and that's why I'm taking on these activities, right? So I'm 36 years old. I didn't really have a full awareness around my abuse until around age 32, 33. Now, typically speaking, a woman doesn't deal with or manage the abuse that she experienced as a young person. She doesn't deal with that until about mid 30s, and men in their mid 40s, right? And what happens in between that childhood and that adulthood, that time when you do, like I said, those unhealthy coping mechanisms and skills that, and I can look back into my like early, mid and late 20s, and even in some cases my early 30s, where I was like doing, taking on certain activities or behaviors, and I was like, wow, I'm bad, or I did something bad, or that's wrong, and I feel a lot of shame around it. And then when I was around 32, 33, and I started had this awareness, like, oh my gosh, those behaviors were rooted in the protection I was trying to provide myself as a young person. So I could eliminate the shame, I could forgive myself, and then I can go out and try to work toward and receive help around eliminating those unhealthy patterns that were showing up in my life. Right. And so when we don't do that, though, and there's no shame around this, and I'm not trying to shame anyone to dealing with the things that they need to deal with, but when we don't deal with the patterns continue to repeat, they can continue to repeat, and then shame could kick in, and maybe even hopelessness and despair, maybe a mental health breakdown eventually, and perhaps even suicidal ideation and suicidal thinking, because despair and hopelessness tend to be the prolonged period of time can be a precursor to suicidal ideation and thinking. So all that to say, abuse certainly has affected my mental health and wellness, and certainly can affect yours as well. So I just want to plant that seed, and maybe you'll be able to deal with your stuff at an earlier age than I did, and you'll have a little bit more of your life to have some help, to have some healthy patterns and things of that nature. So that being said, that was one of the major things that affected my mental health and wellness as a young person. The other thing was that my father's father, my grandfather, died by suicide in the mid 1960s, long before I was born. At the time of his death, my grandfather was almost 50 years old, and his son, my father, was about 17. Now, my dad didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to talk about it. He talked about it to my mom one time, and he told her never to tell us, his kids. And so my mom, when I was 12 and my sister was 13, and my younger brother is quite a bit younger, so he didn't get this information at the time. I think she was really trying to explain why my dad was so abusive and angry, etc. And so she pulled us aside one day and she said, "Don't tell your dad you know this." And she told us about our grandfather. And that was it. It was like a 2-minute conversation. That was basically it. And it was like, go run along. And so I learned something that day. And it's not something that you want to take away. It wasn't something my mom intentionally did. It was just sort of what my little brain was deducing at that time. And it was this: when something bad in life happens and you feel like you can't handle it, keep it a secret. And that's not the thing that I really needed to take away from that. And that's not what we want to do with our lives. When we don't deal with our stuff, it can have detrimental effects on our lives. And in fact, I can give you a little case in point here. I had two health conditions at that age. And I can remember symptoms of these two health conditions as young as 8. However, I didn't get a diagnosis for these two health conditions until age 27. So I went almost 20 years without a diagnosis because I didn't know anybody else who was talking about it. I felt like, well, if I'm having an uber difficult time in my life, I shouldn't talk about it because that's the behavior that was modeled toward me. So I didn't talk about it. And it had a very detrimental effect in my behavior, in my health, in my wellness. And really in health conditions, if we don't do that, those are some of the symptoms. And in some cases, it can become fatal. And for me, it almost was actually around 26, 27. Now, what are those two health conditions? I should let you know because I don't have any shame around it. Might as well tell you. One is called generalized anxiety disorder, and the other is called clinical depression. You're like, whoa, Josh, wait a minute. I thought you said health conditions. I did, because mental health is health. Mental illnesses can affect your health. Mental health and mental illness are not one and of the same. I'll explain that in a few minutes, but I have 2 mental illnesses, and they're nothing to be ashamed of. In society, we often treat health as if there's a line on your neck, and below it is your physical health and something we can talk about, and above it is your mental health and your brain, and it's this funny magical thing we just can't talk about. But no, that's not the case. You've got a machine up here. This is an organ. Your heart is an organ. Your pancreas is an organ. And yet, this is a powerful machine up here, this brain of ours. And, let's put it in terms of like a vehicle, a car, right? You've got a beautiful Maserati up there. Some of you, a vintage, beautiful old, Rolls Royce. Some of you, an old beat up Geo Metro. That's none of my business. But we've got to tune it up every 3,000 miles. We got to take care of this thing, and we need to, put some preventative maintenance on it, and take part in things like this, and take part in being proactive around our mental health and wellness. And we don't do that nearly enough, right? So, real quickly too, I should tell you a little bit. I could tell you about either the depression or the anxiety. I'll choose depression today, right? Because it looks different on different people. We typically see somebody on those medication commercials and they're sad and like the balloons are popping and it's a cloudy day. That's not what my life looks like. I don't have that many balloons. No, but seriously, like that's not what life looks like on the daily. Like if you can see my screen, and if you can't, picture like my arm is under my chin, right? And it's a straight line, because I know some people are on the phone, right? So picture like maybe 1 centimeter, 1 inch below that. That's where my mood sits on the daily. Now, at this point in my life, I know how to sort of manage and work through that and hack some of the chemicals in my brain that boost my mood. And I do different things on the daily, exercising, eating differently, talking to a counselor, intentional acts of service, simple mental hygiene things like drinking lots of water, whatever, right? So I do a lot of different things. And at this point, like, I know my depression pretty well. Like sometimes I feel like my depression is a sparring partner. I've known about it for about 8 years or so. And I view it kind of as a sparring partner sometimes. And I know my sparring partner so well that sometimes I know and I can see that sparring partner throwing a jab at my nose, trying to break it. But instead, I'm able to kind of get out of the way and duck a little bit, and it grazes me on the cheek instead. So that means I'm able to mitigate my symptoms. I'm able to lessen the severity, right? I have that opportunity. So do you, whatever your condition or conditions are. I manage my depression and anxiety. You can manage your kidney disease, heart disease, bipolar, whatever, right? It's not a death sentence. And in fact, sometimes I consider my depression and anxiety my superpower, because I'm able to use them to have big, deep, meaningful conversations all over the US, all over the world, present them, repackage them as a gift to other people, say, hey, you don't have to suffer the way that you are or the way that you have been. You can do differently, right? So I take that pain and repackage it and give it as a gift. Now, you don't have to do that. You could do something different. You don't have to be a speaker. You could make meaning of any difficult situation. Teach a kid to tie their shoe. Teach a kid, about your religion in a healthy and kind way. Teach a kid, teach anybody about anything. Give to a charity, give to a foundation. There's a lot of different ways we can make meaning around a difficult situation, but it's a very, very healthy way to live. It's a choice. It's a choice, but it's definitely a different way to go and a healthier way to go. And if we had more time, I'd give you the science and some of the stuff, in a journal paper that would sort of support that. We don't have time for that. So just wanted to toss that at you because we don't have enough context around mental illnesses, right? So all right. So back to the story, age 12, fast forward age 19. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Age 19, I just finished a year of community college, but I couldn't stay at home. I was living at home. I couldn't do it anymore. It was too abusive. It was too chaotic there. So I did what a lot of people do who had a difficult childhood. I moved to New York City and I became a professional actor. Yes. And so I did that. I did pretty well with that. Broadway, I was singing. I actually started writing for the theater. I was doing voiceover work for, national commercials on radio and TV. It was a really interesting time in my life. Age 24, 25, my parents finally broke up. My mom left my dad, and I was living in New York. They were in Jersey, so we're about 3 hours away. And we saw that divorce coming for about 30 years. They finally did it. They were going through the process, and my mom was sort of happy going through a difficult time. My dad kind of took it difficult, and we didn't really see him taking it the way he took it, and he took a downward spiral pretty quickly. And on March 31, 2009, the day they were supposed to finalize their divorce in court, my dad died by suicide. And I did not like him, but I loved him, and I didn't want to see him suffer, and I didn't want to see him die. And so that threw the next couple of years of my life into some major chaos. Over the next 20 months, interestingly enough, there was a sort of weird juxtaposition. Like my professional life was really taking off. I was back in school. I had a play that was doing really well. That side note actually still tours to this day. And some really kind of fun and funky, interesting things were happening. But my personal life was taking a nosedive. Of course, dad was gone at that point. My mom, who was kind of been the decent, kind, normal, whatever parent, sued me and my brother for the inheritance that my dad left us. And my girlfriend of 6 years, who I'd lived with for 5.5, was very close with, but she left me as well because I wasn't a really good partner at the time. I was going through a difficult time. So I lost 3 major people all at one time. And on top of that, I was experiencing 2 mental health conditions that I didn't even know I had. And so the symptoms were very much out of control, especially the beginning of 2011, really the culmination of the end of that 20-month period. And for those next 6 weeks, between the beginning of January and the middle of February, I was a couple weeks shy of my 27th birthday. And, I was going through all this turmoil and all this chaos. Everything felt brand new and scary, and I felt lost. My mental health conditions were out of control. A lot of major change. I lost a lot of relationships, and I wasn't taking care of my mental health and wellness nor my mental hygiene. And I didn't even know what that stuff was at the time. But I can tell you looking back, I wasn't taking care of myself. So I started thinking that nobody loved me and that nobody cared about me, and the world would be better off if I weren't in it. And that's not true. That was never true. But I was just unwell at the time. We talk about knee aches and back aches. I was having a psych ache. Truly. It was treatable. It was manageable. I just didn't know it at the time. So long story short, middle of February, I nearly attempted suicide. And luckily, I reached out to the last person in the world that I wanted to talk to, but I didn't know where else to go. And it definitely felt like a risk. I ended up calling my mother. And that conversation was very much a what to do, what not to do. And I think we'll have time to model that conversation a little later, because I do want to talk to y'all about and engage with y'all about how to help a friend in crisis. And it could be to varying levels, but I think it's an important piece of this conversation. But luckily, so she did become a mom again after sort of doing what you're not supposed to do. Then she sort of switched gears. And then from there, I got help through my university's counseling center and through friends and through some research on neuroscience. And I was sort of lucked into figuring out that intentional acts of service were very helpful to my brain and my psyche, and a lot of different things. It took about 9 months for me to feel whole again and feel like me again. But I was always moving forward. Some days, certainly it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I was able to get help. And one of the things that I realized was to be whole again, I needed to be in the service of other people. And so I really wanted, one of those things was to start doing this work. So I started researching mental health and researching wellness and what that meant. And so this is kind of where we do a little slide share. I think that's tremendously important. We'll toss some stuff up on the screen. So give me a second as I do that. We got to know what mental health is. And I mean, it's kind of a dead giveaway here. There's a lot of misconception around mental health, and we got to define it first and foremost. There's a lot of people think mental health and mental illness are one and of the same, and they're not. A lot of times, especially if I go to like a middle school or a high school and I'll do a similar talk, it's not the same as what I'm doing here, but I'll ask everybody either, probably usually at the top, like, by a show of hands, how many people in the room have mental health? And usually it's about half the room raises their hand, and you get a few like peer pressure raises. And then, I'm like, everybody put your hand out. It's a trick question. Everybody has mental health, so we kind of conflate like mental health and mental illness being one and of the same. Mental illness can affect your mental health, but just, we talk about the screwed up side all the time. We don't talk about the healthy side. Like case in point, I was in an Uber about 1.5 years ago when I was living in LA, and I was on my way to the airport about to do a gig. It was like 4 a.m. This gentleman, my Uber driver, asked me what I did for a living, and I just kind of didn't want to talk too much because it was 4 a.m. And so I told him I give talks on mental health, and he's like, "Oh, mental health, that sure is going around." And I was very kind, and I had a decent conversation with him, but I wanted to tell him, like, "Sir, it's not the common cold. It's not going around. We all have mental health. You're thinking of mental illness, right?" So there's a lot of misconception, even just around the vocabulary. So like, what is it? What is it not? Mental health is not necessarily debilitating, right? Because again, it's there's a healthy side, there's an unhealthy side. And as I said, it's not necessarily exclusive with an illness or a disorder. And the character flaw or weakness piece, that's more of a more commentary around the mental illness side. But regardless, like whether you have positive mental health or whether you're living with a mental illness, neither of them are a character flaw or weakness. In fact, I consider my mental illnesses to be a point of strength because I use them as a tool, as I mentioned before. And I have to do things differently, I think, than people who don't have mental illnesses. And I have to do things to get through the day sometimes that really require like a lot of mental acrobatics, like not every day, but there are some days that are harder to get through than others. And so the fact that I'm able to use them and sort of push and pull my mental illnesses when I need to, I think that's a point of strength. And a lot of the people I know living with mental illnesses as well would say the same thing. What is it? It affects everybody for sure. I mean, it's definitely a little different for everybody. So like a lot of this, like some of the things I'm going to be talking about, like it's a template rather than a step-by-step, right? So like there's no one size fits all to all this. It's got to do, your mental health is affected by your biology, your life experience, and family history. And it certainly takes time and energy to develop. I know there's certain things about my body and how my body and my brain sort of work in tandem or don't sometimes. I've learned a lot about that during the time of COVID-19. I've had to, learn different coping mechanisms and tools. I've learned new things that have helped me out. And so things I do today, a lot of them I've been doing for 8-9 years, but there's a lot of new stuff that I've integrated into the mix. So, so it takes time, it takes energy. Now this next slide, this is important. I think it's important. And I'll explain what it means. Because again, we're not typically on the same page around our vocabulary around mental health, right? We don't know how to self-diagnose or reach out for treatment properly all the time. One of the ways this shows up is in our language, right? So I'll hear people say from time to time, and I'll just use an example, maybe a little more pertinent to Ohio. Like, man, the Cavs lost last night and my girlfriend yelled at me and I stubbed my toe this morning. I'm so depressed. And I'm totally willing to unwrap that with somebody. Like if they want to have that conversation, I'm totally willing to sit and listen. Chances are though, you're having a bad day. You're not experiencing depression. And so when we don't know what we're dealing with, then we don't know how to reach out for the proper coping mechanism or tool or resource, right? And there are a lot of analogies that one could make around the physical health side of things. But specifically around mental health, when we don't know what we have, then we don't know how to treat it. We don't know how to get help, right? So any of these meters, like a bad day, kind of self-explanatory. A situational crisis, that could be, the death of a friend or a loved one or a pet. It could be COVID-19 for sure, because it's not going to last forever. So we're experiencing situational emotions and feelings and chemical reactions around the situation at hand. And then the third one on my right, I think it would be on your right too, this illness condition, that's just something more chronic. That could be bipolar or fibromyalgia or back, chronic back pain, something like that. And so if you can see the same colors on these meters, on the far left, it's yellow, which to me kind of represents peace and calm and our ability to manage and deal. And then on the far right is something that to me looks dark orange. And that kind of means like chaos and difficulty and maybe an inability at the moment, at least, to handle and deal and manage, right? And so in 2011, when I was going through the difficult time, all that loss and everything was brand new, as I mentioned, and scary, and I felt lost and I was in crisis. Everything was on all these meters were in the dark orange, right? So, but any of these can move around in different ways at any time, right? So it's important for us to sort of think about this, if not in the same way, in a similar way, so that we can then sort of figure out, is it situational, a bad day, like what's happening, right? So just sort of checking in with your meter and what's happening. And really, when we know what's going on, then we know how to cope. And coping skills are sort of the next part of the conversation. Coping skills, and we could do healthy and we could do unhealthy. There's two sides of the coin, right? And some of it's a little bit gray too. Coping skills, some of them, there's a gray area to it. But they're a combination of different tools that helps us manage the thing that life throws our way. And if anybody's a gamer in here, I used to be a gamer as a kid. I can't say I'm a gamer anymore because if I did, you might not see me for weeks at a time. So I know my boundaries, I know my limits, and video games are that for me. But when I was a kid, we had some cheat codes, for some of these games. And so it'd be like up, down, BY, left, right. And so you'd be able to beat the boss quicker, skip a level, get a tool or something that you could use to help yourself. And so that to me, coping skills to me are like cheat codes for life. I'm able to move through something quicker, easier, more efficiently. I'm able to skip a level, right? So that to me is why coping skills, like intentional coping skills, I think a lot of us have intentional coping skills for sure, and that's fine too. But I want to let's be more intentional about our coping. They're different for everybody. There's no one size fits all. So I'm not going to tell you have to do this or that. Like it's got to be this. You've got to listen to opera music when you're sad. And no, like what kind of works for you. They're open source. They can be modified and changed at any time, and they do take time and energy to develop. Now, these categories, I think we need to pay attention. To me, I'm working on creating something. It's either going to be it's going to look a lot like the food pyramid or the food plate. So like these to me are those categories. And so they all need to be on that plate or in that pyramid. And it's kind of up to us to move it around, and so I need to have 15% more healthy support system in my diet and 10% more healthy distractions, right? So like all these categories should be part of our coping. Healthy support system should largely be a human, but that could be clergy, that your pastor, your imam, your priest, your rabbi. It could be your counselor. It could be your medical doctor, friends and family. It could be in part like a pet or your garden and stuff like that. Like those can be things that you take care of and that support you. Healthy distractions, I think that's a very broad category, but I think we need distractions sometimes. Life is hard. Sometimes we just need to sort of decompress and be like, I need a distraction. I need to watch Golden Girls this evening and have a candy bar. Like that's all right. You can do that sometimes. Relaxation or self-care is so important. Y'all, I know how it goes. I'm actually in school right now too. I'm of a different age than most of y'all, but I'm fully ingrained in school enough to where I know there's these conversations that happen where like, man, I slept 3 hours last night because I was studying and I did the night before. And like, yeah, well, I only slept 2 hours last night. Like where everyone's having like a pissing contest about how crabby they feel. Like, no, that's not cute, guys. It's not cute, y'all. Like we need to take care of ourselves. Some of these basic mental hygiene things like sleeping, eating, taking care of ourselves, even just a little bit of exercise, like some of our anxiousness or feelings of depression, especially if you're not living with the actual mental illness side of those, they can be mitigated with some of that basic mental hygiene stuff, right? So, and that involves self-care, setting boundaries. Like 9 of my friends always come to me and I don't have the energy. All right, set a boundary. Listen, 8 of y'all, I don't have the energy today. It's not a no forever. It's just a no for tonight. I'm going to come back to you, right? Put your mask on first before, the old airplane analogy. Put your mask on first before you put someone else's oxygen mask on, right? You got to take care of you. Service-based activities. Man, that's a great way to boost mood, to boost dopamine and serotonin, to be intentional about it. You can do stuff online. I'm doing a little bit of service-based activity online. I'm doing a little bit offline that requires no interaction as well, right? But service-based activities are huge. A lot of, I think it's great, like the 12-step model. If anyone's familiar with like Overeaters Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, anything sort of those 12-step programs Anonymous. One of the interesting sort of things about those programs, and I'm oversimplifying, but to receive help, one must help someone else, right? Helping someone else is a great way to help yourself. And I would say, it's not inside out work, it's outside in work, and that's okay. We can do that external work on ourselves and our lives, right? So that service-based activities can be very huge. Energetic activities, exercise, things you consume, reducing workload, for sure. This is an important piece of the puzzle. How to help a person in any element of crisis, any level of crisis. When I reached out to my mom back in 2011, I called her and I hadn't talked to her in about 6 months. So I really kind of had no relationship with her at the moment. And when I called her, I got about a minute in and I was crying and bawling and kind of explaining what was going on in my life and how things were going well. And she stopped me and was like, Josh, you need to get right with God. You need to get back in the church. And I got really upset with her and I threatened to hang up on her. And she switched gears and then she became my mom again. Now, and then the rest of these bullet points, she more or less hit without having the proper training. I don't know if it was instinctual or what, but when, over the next year after, as I was receiving help and sort of rebounding and in recovery, I thought back to that conversation quite a bit. And I thought about, I was like, why did I get so upset about her religious piece? Because it never made sense to me as a kid, and it didn't make sense to me as an unwell adult, but I shouldn't have gotten as upset about it as I did. And I finally figured it out with a little help. And the reason I got upset was because she was trying to fix me. And nobody in the history of the universe has ever fixed another person. It's not possible. You can't do it. And when we come in to a situation and we're trying to fix somebody without asking them what kind of help they need, you're dishonoring their personhood and their dignity and their integrity. Just because they're having a difficult time doesn't mean they're any less of a person, doesn't mean that they're any less complete, happy, or not, excuse me, complete and whole, right? They're not a broken person. They're bent, not broken, right? So we need to treat people as such. The shoe might be on the other foot at some point in life. You wouldn't want somebody treating you that way, right? And so when you come at somebody, and you're like, I've got a tool. I'm gonna fix you. Like, and you just like, hey, did you think about your family? Did you go for a run? Did you try to stop being depressed? Like, that's not helpful. Like, you're like, I've got a hammer. Well, their crisis might need a saw or a screwdriver or both, and all you're doing is waving around a hammer, and it's not helpful, right? So what I'll do when somebody comes to me and they're having a difficult time of any level, I would like, time out. What's the best way that I can be of service to you in this moment? Would you like advice? Would you like me to listen, scream, yell, cry, hold you, play some basketball? While, what is it that I can do to be of best service? And that people like, they love that, because now you see them and you hear them and you're working to understand them. And chances are, especially when it's a severe crisis, like a very severe crisis, chances are that person hasn't felt seen or heard in a very long time, right? And that is that's important. We all want to feel seen and heard, right? So how can I be of best service? What do you need? And from there, we're listening. Listen, and listen some more. Validate their experience. Those clues to keep them grounded, you're validating their experience. Like, you can say, hey, like, I just want to let you know, like, I think it's amazing that you're still suiting up and showing up, or whatever it is. Like, just come from a strength-based place. Like, if they get a little salty with you, you can be like, hey, wow, I'm not here for that. But also, like, wow, you're really good at putting up defenses. How'd you get so good at that? Right? You could totally flip that on its head, and it will, so look for those moments of strength where people usually don't look, right? I mean, it could be glaringly obvious, but even if you can't find something, look in those little places where seemingly nobody else, it'll disarm the other person, and it'll engender trust and loyalty, and will allow that conversation to go much better. No judgment, of course. Empathy over sympathy over pity, right? Sympathy and pity to me kind of bleed together a little bit. But empathy is like, I feel you, lo siento, I feel you, rather than I feel, rather than like, I feel so badly for you. Nobody wants that. And that could go into, what to say when somebody is having a hard time. People ask me that all, what do I say? I don't know what to say. I don't want to engage with somebody because I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. And you can be honest. You can say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here with you. I'm with you, and we'll figure this out together. If they say that they're scared, you can say, I'm scared too, if you are, right? Because part of this conversation is about you being vulnerable, not just them, right? We want, if we want somebody to be vulnerable with us and to spill their guts and talk about what's going on, if they're not willingly speaking about it already, we're going to have to be a little bit vulnerable ourselves. Share some self-disclosure, the time you got help, how much they mean to you. That's sort of the next piece, like being explicit that their life is important to you. And that we can, and by the way, y'all don't have to wait for a crisis or a eulogy or anything like that to wait to say that to somebody. We do that all the time. We're making sure that they're safe too, right? And that could just mean that if it's appropriate, if they're that kind of a friend and that kind of person in our life, They could maybe stay at our place that night. We want to make sure that other people know about the crisis, not in a gossipy way, but like people who can help and support, right? So that we have multi-tiered layers of support. And that also could mean at the very bottom that we're assisting and referring them to professional help. And that could look like campus services. That could be a hotline. That could be a clergy person. That could be a lot of different things, depending on the level of difficulty or crisis. But in some cases, depending on how deep the situation is, we're going to need that extra professional help. But we're always going to need some kind of multi-tiered layer of support. I want to throw up some resources on here. I think resources are very important. Take some screenshots of these. You might not need these, but you might know somebody who will need them, right? So you got the Youngstown State Counseling Services, the time, the phone number. There's some really good resources on the university's COVID-19 page as well. There's the hotline, the suicide prevention hotline, the crisis text line, the Trevor Project. Those are more like hotline warm lines. But if you're in, wherever you are in the country, you're going to get somebody in your area and not somebody like, all the way across the country. So that also means like you could ask them for like local resources, maybe if you need to, and not just for you, but for a friend, right? So you're not necessarily just calling for you. You can call and ask about a friend. You can call with a friend for the friend, right? So there's those kinds of options. A few others. I'm going to put up 5 other pages of resources, and I'll just sort of briefly, not all of these are therapeutic. Some of them are. Not every situation around mental health, a mental health breakdown requires, counseling, but we're talking about preventative maintenance. We're taking care of it. It's regular upkeep. We're not waiting for something bad to happen to then pay attention to and talk about our mental health. But so I have a lot of different resources. Some of them are peer-to-peer, some of the things to read. But this is important, right? Not just to have singular kinds of resources. And here's what I'll say around that. For instance, not everybody speaks English as a first language, right? And so they might only feel comfortable engaging maybe in counseling services in their first language, and that could be Spanish or Arabic or Swahili. I went to a Spanish-speaking country a couple years ago, and I do pretty well. I speak Spanish about as well as like a 5 or 6 year old, and I can curse like a sailor. It's important stuff. So, but I realized, while I was there, I was by myself. It was a really cool trip. But I realized that if I had to engage with a doctor or a mental health therapist, I wouldn't be able to talk to them on a high level. I'd need to talk to somebody in English. So here, again, not everybody speaks English as a first language, but also not everybody speaks middle-aged white guy as a first language, right? Like we might need to engage with people who look like us and sound like us and have similar cultural or life experiences. Some of my experiences, Josh, are universal, but not all of them are. Right, so we need to honor that, and so that's why I have these resources. Some Latinx stuff up here. I'll give you just a second. We got some Asian American, some BIPOC stuff, and some of these too are clearinghouses. So you're going to find more resources on some of these pages, right, of varying levels and degrees, and different things to engage with, and then resources for Indigenous and Native American persons. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I am going to wind this down with a challenge, and then we're going to be able to talk to each other. You can ask questions. I think Avery had people go into his email, but you can also ask through the chat as well. And you can also ask anonymously if you don't feel comfortable being seen or heard around that. So I don't want to steal your thunder, Avery, around people sending to your email address. But if it does take down, a barrier, or if they didn't see that, then I want to offer that as well. You can certainly ask publicly as well, but this challenge I want to toss your way, and I will take this challenge as well because I think it's important. It's a two-parter. The first part is a quote. It's a Gandhi quote. We've all heard it. We know it. We can probably quote it by heart, but I want to provide some context. Be the change you wish to see in the world. We're like, whoa, all right, context. That means if you don't like something, you change it. If you think it's always been that way, it hasn't. It hasn't. Why can't any of us, whether you're watching the recorded version or you're on the live stream, why can't any of us be the spark that lights the fire to change this world, right? Don't let anyone ever tell you you're not smart enough, big enough, young enough, old enough, brown enough, talented enough, anything enough. You're more than enough to be the change. Josh, man, I'm 5'3" and I'm 19 and I wear a hijab. Well, we need 5'3" and 19 to wear a hijab. We need that. We need everybody right? We need everybody. There's power in that. There's power in your experience, right? Oh, Josh, I'll be somebody when I graduate. No, we need somebody. We need you now. We'll need you when you graduate, but we need you now because there's so much wisdom and experience and things that you could teach us now. We need you now, right? The second piece that is to tell your story, to speak up, speak out, and speak often. Tell your story. You know, there was a young lady a couple years ago. I was speaking at an event in North Carolina, and there's about 250 people in the room. And after the event, the Q&A was over, everything was over, and she came up to me and she was like, "Josh, I wish I talked about my experience in the Q&A. I almost did, but what I've been through feels insignificant compared to what you've been through." And she spoke in metaphor. She was like, or simile rather. She was like, it was like I've been through a hangnail. Like that's all I've ever been through, and you've experienced this bloody open wound. And I was like, okay, cool, I feel you. And then I asked her if I can unwrap that with her and challenge her, and she agreed. So I said this, more or less, I'll distill the conversation to this. And I said, you know what, next time I want to challenge you, next time you're in a situation like this, big or small, room, big or small, it doesn't have to be 250 people, but bring that up, talk about it. Because there's a great chance that there's at least one other person, if not multiples, especially in a room this size, that other people have been through that similar hangnail as you. And so now you have an opportunity for trust and loyalty to make a friend, to feel less alone, for them to feel less alone, to share resources, right? That's a beautiful thing. And on top of that, I can tell you that when I was 8 years old, my depression and anxiety was nothing more than a hangnail. But because I didn't talk about it for almost 20 years, it became a bloody open wound, right? So that's why it's so important to tell your story. So speak up, speak out, speak often, tell your story, be the change. Thank you, Youngstown State. You guys are the bomb.